My name is Mark, and most of my evenings are pretty uneventful. A day at the office, a long commute home, dinner in front of the TV, nothing to write home about. But that evening turned out to be different, and I wish I could forget everything that happened. It was a Thursday, and work had been rough. My coworker Tom, a guy I'd known for years, suggested unwinding at a new club he'd heard about downtown. He called it a unique experience and promised it wasn't like the usual places we'd go. I hesitated at first. These types of places never really appealed to me. But I was tired, looking for a way to shake off the stress, so I finally agreed. The club was tucked away in a back alley, far from the usual bustling streets. A place you wouldn't find unless you knew where to look. A simple neon sign above the door read Elysium, its blue glow casting eerie shadows on the cracked brick walls. The alleyway leading to it was narrow, flanked by trash cans and the faint hum of a flickering streetlight. It didn't exactly scream luxury, but there was a strange allure to it, like a place that promised secrets behind every shadow. When we stepped inside, the atmosphere shifted. The interior was all dark red velvet and soft, dim lights that gave the place a moody, otherworldly glow. It was busy but not crowded, and the stage at the center of the room seemed like the focus of everyone's attention. The air was thick with a faint, sweet-smelling smoke, and the music was a low, pulsing rhythm that seemed to resonate in my chest. Tom nudged me with his elbow and pointed to the stage. "You won't regret it," he whispered with a grin, and then he vanished into the crowd. I assumed he went to find us a drink, but I didn't really care at that moment. My eyes were drawn to the stage, to the figure slowly emerging from the shadows. She stepped into the soft light, moving with a slow, graceful sway. Her face was mostly obscured by the shadows and the curls of smoke that drifted lazily through the air. Something about her movements felt different, deliberate, almost hypnotic. As she danced, I found myself unable to look away, like there was some invisible thread pulling me closer, making me forget everything else around me. For a moment, I thought her eyes flicked toward me, glinting beneath the dim lights, but it was hard to tell. Her expression was unreadable, like a mask, hiding whatever thoughts lay behind those dark, shadowed eyes. I felt a chill crawl up my spine, and the dim glow of the neon lights around the stage seemed to grow colder, casting an unnatural pallor over the room. When Tom finally reappeared with our drinks, I snapped back to reality. He handed me a glass and shot me a knowing smirk. "See what I mean? There's something about this place, right?" I nodded slowly, taking a sip, trying to shake the unease creeping through my veins. The drink was bitter and left a strange aftertaste. I tried to focus on the music, on the other people at the tables around us, but the dancer on the stage still held my attention like a magnet. It wasn't long before Tom got distracted, chatting with some people he recognized from another bar. I barely noticed. My focus kept drifting back to the stage. The show went on, and every performer seemed to carry the same strange aura, like they knew something the rest of us didn't. Their smiles never reached their eyes. That's when I noticed something odd. At the back of the club, just past the stage lights, was a door I hadn't seen before. It was set into the shadows, half concealed by heavy curtains. Every time a performer left the stage, they would disappear behind that door. It had no sign, no indication of what lay behind it. But I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was on the other side, it wasn't meant for the casual visitor. I leaned over to ask Tom about it, but he was already deep in conversation with a group at another table. I was left alone with my curiosity, and that strange, unsettling feeling that something wasn't right. I could hear the low hum of whispers from the other tables, people talking in hushed tones that blended into the music. But I couldn't catch any words, just a sense of urgency, of secrets slipping between the beats. As the night wore on, the unease in my gut grew stronger, twisting into a tight knot. The performers kept disappearing behind that shadowed door, and each time I glanced toward it, I thought I caught movement, like something shifting just beyond the curtain's edge. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I stood up, leaving Tom with his new friends, and made my way toward the back of the club. The door seemed to beckon me, promising answers or at least some end to this feeling that I couldn't quite name. As I got closer, I felt the temperature drop, like the air around the door was colder than the rest of the room. My hand reached out, brushing against the heavy curtain. I paused, wondering if I should just turn around, go back to my seat, and forget about the whole thing. But the pull was too strong. I needed to see what was behind that door. I pushed it open. The air on the other side was even colder, the smell of that sweet smoke replaced with something more metallic, almost like blood. A chill ran through me as I stepped inside, the shadows swallowing the light from the club behind me. The room was small, almost claustrophobic, with old wooden floors that creaked underfoot. And there, in the center, was a large ancient mirror. It was framed in dark, ornate wood, covered in strange carvings that twisted in ways that hurt my eyes if I stared too long. The glass itself was fogged, as though it hadn't been cleaned in decades, but I could just make out my own reflection in the dim light. I took a step closer, but before I could examine it further, the door behind me creaked shut, and I heard the unmistakable sound of a lock clicking into place. I spun around, my heart hammering in my chest, but there was no one there. The only light came from a single dim bulb hanging above the mirror, casting long shadows across the floor. The room was silent, the music from the club muffled behind the heavy walls, leaving me alone with the reflection in front of me. I took a step closer to the mirror, my breath misting up the glass. For a moment, I just stared at my own face, pale, nervous, the sweat beading on my forehead. But then, as I leaned in, the fog on the glass began to clear, revealing something behind me in the reflection. It was her, the dancer from the stage. She stood just behind me, her face still hidden in shadow, her eyes glinting with that same unreadable expression. My blood turned to ice, and I whipped around to face her, but there was nothing there. The room was empty. I looked back at the mirror, and she was still there, standing in the same place, watching me. My knees almost buckled with fear, but I couldn't tear my eyes away. Her lips moved slowly, forming words that I couldn't hear, couldn't understand. The shadows seemed to shift around her, growing darker, denser, until it felt like the room itself was breathing. I backed away, my hands shaking as I reached for the door handle, pulling at it desperately. But the lock held firm, the wood unyielding. Panic began to claw at me. My breath came in ragged gasps, and I could feel my heartbeat thundering in my ears. The dancer in the mirror tilted her head, her expression shifting into something that almost looked like pity. That's when I heard it. A soft whisper, right by my ear, but no one was there. "Why did you come here?" The voice was barely audible, like it was carried on the wind, but I felt it deep in my bones, a cold that seeped into my core. My hands tightened around the door handle, yanking with all my strength, but the door wouldn't budge. I turned back to the mirror, desperate for any explanation, but what I saw made my blood run cold. She was closer now, her face inches from mine, her eyes, dark, endless, boring into my soul. And in those eyes, I saw something horrible, a reflection of places and things that didn't belong in this world. I wanted to scream, but my voice caught in my throat. She continued to mouth those same silent words, her lips barely moving, but the urgency in her expression was unmistakable. It felt like she was trying to warn me about something, but I couldn't understand. The more I stared into those dark eyes, the more I felt like I was falling through the glass, into the darkness beyond. Suddenly, the light flickered above me, and for a split second, the room was plunged into darkness. When the bulb flickered back on, my reflection had changed. I was no longer alone. The dancer stood directly behind me, her hand resting lightly on my shoulder, but it was as cold as death. Her eyes, no longer shadowed, glowed with a dim, unnatural light that seemed to come from somewhere deep within her. I felt her grip tighten, her fingers digging into my shoulder with an inhuman strength. My skin crawled at her touch, the cold seeping into my bones. I turned my head slowly, barely daring to breathe, but again, there was nothing behind me, only the emptiness of the room. Yet in the reflection, she remained, her grip on me unyielding, her eyes never leaving mine. I tried to speak, to ask her what she wanted, but my words came out as a strangled gasp. Instead, I turned my focus back to the door, yanking at the handle with all the strength I had left. But the dancer's face in the mirror twisted into something between a smile and a grimace. It was a look that sent waves of terror rippling through me, like she was amused by my struggle, but also sorrowful, as if she knew my fate was already sealed. Then, in a voice barely more than a whisper, I heard it again, her voice, coming from all around me, yet from nowhere at all. "You never should have looked." The lights flickered once more, and the room felt like it was spinning, the shadows growing thicker, swallowing the corners of the space. I closed my eyes, trying to block out the dizziness, the cold, the fear, but when I opened them again, the room had changed. The mirror was gone. Instead, I found myself standing in a long, narrow hallway that stretched on endlessly into darkness. The walls were covered in tattered, stained red velvet, the same material that adorned the club outside. But here, it was old and decaying, falling apart at the seams. The air was thick with a damp, rotten smell, like something had been left to fester here for years. I took a hesitant step forward, my legs unsteady, my mind reeling. What had happened to the room I was just in? Where was I now? Panic gripped me, and I spun around, hoping to find the door behind me, to find some way out of this nightmare. But the door was gone too. I was trapped. I started down the hallway, one shaky step at a time, the silence pressing in on my ears. As I walked, I could hear faint noises, whispers, like dozens of voices speaking all at once, too quiet to make out, but urgent, pleading. They seemed to echo off the velvet-covered walls, surrounding me, growing louder with every step. I tried to ignore them, to focus on finding an end to the hallway, but the whispers seeped into my thoughts, like tiny claws scratching at the inside of my skull. Just when I thought I couldn't bear it anymore, I saw a door at the end of the hall. It was old, made of dark wood, its surface carved with strange, swirling patterns that hurt my eyes if I stared too long. It seemed like my only option, so I approached it, every part of me screaming that I should turn back, that I should have never stepped through that first door. But what choice did I have now? I reached out and turned the brass knob, and the door creaked open with a low, mournful groan. The room beyond was shrouded in darkness, but as I stepped inside, the lights slowly came to life, revealing a large, empty space with a single object at its center. A chair, old and worn, with leather straps hanging from its arms and legs, like something out of an interrogation room. My heart stuttered in my chest as I realized what I was looking at. It wasn't just a chair, it was a place of restraint, of punishment. And lying across the floor, coiled around the base of the chair, were thick chains, covered in rust and dark stains that I didn't want to think too much about. That's when I heard the creak of the door behind me. I spun around, expecting to see another shadow or trick of the light, but instead, I saw a figure standing in the doorway. It was the dancer, her face still half hidden in shadow, her eyes glowing with that same eerie light. But she wasn't alone. Shadows swirled around her, twisting into vague shapes. Figures that seemed to move just at the edge of my vision. Figures that looked almost human but wrong, distorted. They crowded around her, pressing against the doorframe, as if eager to enter the room. She pointed at the chair, her finger long and thin, almost skeletal. I could hear that same voice from before, though her lips didn't move. It whispered through the room, seeping into my mind like smoke. "Sit." My legs trembled, my back pressed against the cold wall behind me, but I couldn't look away from her eyes. They held a power that I couldn't fight, a cold, magnetic pull that made my thoughts foggy. I took a step back, but my feet felt like they were sinking into the floor, like the room itself was trying to pull me in. "No," I managed to croak, my voice barely above a whisper. "No, I'm not." But before I could finish, the shadows in the doorway shifted. The figures moved, pouring into the room, gliding along the walls and the ceiling, their movements jerky, unnatural. They wrapped around me, pressing in, forcing me forward, closer to the chair. I stumbled, falling to my knees in front of it, the cold chains scraping against my skin. My breath came in ragged gasps as I fought against the invisible force that pressed down on me. But it was no use. The dancer's eyes burned into mine, and her shadowy companions reached out with long, grasping fingers, guiding me into the chair, strapping my wrists and ankles with the old leather. As the last strap tightened, the dancer stepped closer, her expression unreadable, her shadow falling over me like a shroud. I tried to ask her why, but the words wouldn't come. All I could do was stare up at her, my mind swimming in terror and confusion. Her face seemed to shift as she loomed over me, as if a dozen faces were layered on top of each other, all trapped beneath her skin, shifting and writhing. "Why did you come here?" The voices whispered again, all around me, and I could feel my mind slipping, breaking beneath the weight of their question. The lights dimmed once more, leaving only a narrow beam above me, casting long shadows across the floor. I couldn't move, couldn't struggle against the straps that bound me. I felt the shadows tightening around my chest, pressing down until every breath was a battle. The dancer leaned closer, her face inches from mine. Her lips twisted into a smile that held no warmth, only a deep, terrible sadness. Her mouth opened, and I could hear the whispers again, but now I could finally understand them. "This place is not what it seems. It is a doorway, a passageway for those who cannot rest." Her eyes bore into mine, and for a moment, I saw it all. The countless souls who had come through this club, drawn in by the allure, by the promise of something different. But they were trapped, all of them, bound to this place, caught in the endless cycle of shadows and whispers. I realized then that she wasn't my captor. She was a prisoner too. And just as that realization hit me, the shadows surged forward, consuming the room, consuming her, consuming me. The last thing I saw was her face, twisted in a scream that I couldn't hear, and then everything went black. I woke up in an alley behind the club, cold pavement pressing against my cheek. The sun was rising, casting long beams of light down the alleyway. I sat up, my head throbbing, my skin clammy. When I looked back, the door to the club was shut tight, the neon sign no longer glowing. But I could still feel them. The shadows, the cold presence of the dancer, lingering at the edges of my mind, as if they were watching me even now. I stumbled to my feet, my legs weak beneath me, and made my way back to my car, vowing never to return. Yet as I drove away, I couldn't help but glance in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see her standing there, hidden in the shadows, her eyes still glowing in the dim light. But there was nothing, just an empty alley and a club that no longer existed in the daylight. And yet, every time I hear whispers in the dark, or catch a glimpse of movement out of the corner of my eye, I wonder if I truly escaped, or if I left a part of myself behind, trapped in that place where the shadows never fade.